Red Bull are set to introduce the first step of their radical concept change in Suzuka, and it seems like the temperatures here will allow the team to go further with the radiator inlets as well as the bodywork changes that will reminisce a lot of the W13 and the W14's initial design. However, it's not a given that Red Bull understood everything they needed in order to not make the same mistake as Mercedes, and with Ferrari catching up rapidly with the Austrian team, could we see Red Bull actually slip up in the pecking order? And more importantly, how will that translate to the rest of the season? Well, it's safe to say that Red Bull have a lot of challenges in front of them right now, despite two very dominant 1-2 wins in the first 3 races in the season. But the Melbourne GP has shown that Ferrari made a large step ahead when it comes to tyre degradation and airflow management, which only goes to prove that Adrian Newey was in the right when he said that the team is forced to chase a new challenge with the RB20, and that would be extracting performance out of a design that was labelled to be a failure from Mercedes. The first step will be made in Suzuka, where the team will introduce the vertical radiator inlets that were more or less impossible to introduce in the first 3 races due to the high temperatures on the track. With this, Red Bull is putting a large emphasis on the cooling of the engine, but at the same time, they're able to get good usage of a rule that enables them to work around the restrictions they have within the wind tunnel, something we'll get into deeper later in this video. Now, the Austrian team is definitely the leader when it comes to having a proper downforce generation from the floor, and it's obvious that they've set the precedent in this question. But by being forced to chase something so risky yet so ambitious goes to show that there are a lot of question marks they will have to answer in Imola. On paper, however, this design is by far the fastest one in the frame of the current regulations, as Mercedes' theory was that by shrinking the bodywork, they will be able to increase the surface area of the floor and then increase the amount of downforce that will be generated from it. Of course, the risk that Red Bull is taking is huge, but it's not an uncalculated one. For example, the team plans to revamp the entire design on its car thanks to introducing a new side pod and floor design. But if they are to bring both of these parts in Suzuka, then they wouldn't be able to extract as much as they would want from each part. Therefore, it's going to be either one of these 2 parts that would be prioritized in Suzuka, and judging by the downforce requirements of the track, is definitely a smart move because this is the time in which Red Bull must not drop the ball now that teams like Ferrari are threatening to be a lot more competitive in the foreseeable future. And if we are to look at Ferrari's performance in Melbourne, you can understand why Red Bull have kind of forced the upgrade process to Suzuka first and then to Imola, a pattern that they have introduced much earlier than Ferrari, as the Maranello team was poised to bring the entire package to the Italian GP. The tyre degradation of both Ferrari drivers was extremely satisfying, and they were able to extend their stints much longer than originally expected, which was kind of a normal scenario given the fact that Sainz was running in clean air and Leclerc was not chasing to overtake. But it's still a massive positive point for the Maranello team, and something that Red Bull needs to take in consideration for the upcoming race in Suzuka. But what was the problem with Mercedes, and why are Red Bull believing that this design can bring them a lot of performance in the upcoming races? The issue with Mercedes was that the car was moved outside its perfect operating window due to the structural restrictions it had with the narrow chassis and the gearbox, and every time the car was running on bumpy surfaces, the phenomenon of porpoising was triggered due to its proximity to the ground. This, of course, is not an issue we're expecting to see with Red Bull, but once you're entering the 3rd year in a constant regulations and the budget cap is further shed down for an additional $5 million, it's evident that the rest of the grid is bound to catch up at a certain point in the season. This is one of the greatest risks that Red Bull have acknowledged inside their camp prior to the introduction of the new design in Suzuka, and when talking about this matter even further, Max Verstappen went on to say that it's not a given that they will be competitive like they were last year, further adding, "So far we've been very good, but of course everyone has a bit of different characteristics in their cars as well, so it's not a given that we will be very competitive in Suzuka like we were last year. But I'm excited, it's a track that I really enjoyed driving on last year, and I'm confident with this year's car. The upgrades of the RB20, I can say that the colour of our car will be the same, you'll see." But when you're adopting solutions that other teams have done in the past, and not just any team, this is Mercedes we're talking about, and when these solutions have proved to be quite problematic, you tend to raise a question as to whether or not it was worth risking so much dominance in order to set a new standard in the sport. However, Newey's opinion was quite clear. It is needed due to the fact that the RB19 was the top of its league and they couldn't have extracted much more out of that design, proving that if they continued to chase it, they would have remained vulnerable and easy to pass due to the lack of engine supremacy compared to Ferrari, for example. Regardless, Red Bull have played their cards perfectly well. The team understood what needs to be done in order to test these upgrades to a further extent without being hurt from the wind tunnel restrictions. For example, the zero pod design has enabled Red Bull to use a trick that allows exceptions for wind tunnel testing solely for the development of power unit heat exchangers that reject heat to air or the running of the power unit from a boundary commencing at the power unit air intake ducts. What Red Bull have essentially done here is that they've placed a huge emphasis on the cooling of the engine by doing a complete reshuffle, or repackaging as you would like to call it, on the internal component, which falls outside of the aerodynamic testing restrictions to enable the team to spend less of its allowance refining the external bodywork. When you have such a stable platform to build onto, it's only a matter of time when you're going to set a new standard that the others can and will be forced to follow. However, the stable regulations did allow for closer racing for every driver behind Verstappen, and that in itself is a scenery we're hoping could apply to the number one driver on the grid as well. Now, of course, there are lots of questions to be answered in Red Bull, such as whether or not Perez can be the second driver in the team if Verstappen is not there to take over, such as the case in Melbourne. Yes, driving with floor damage is definitely raising some concerns about the full capacity of the car, but be that as it may, finishing 40 seconds behind the leading pack is a massive question mark as to whether or not there is any opportunity for him to be competitive with Ferrari and McLaren, and his statement goes to prove that to a further extent as well. Red Bull will have to face Ferrari's upgrade package in Suzuka as well, and on top of that, the statements that are coming from McLaren are quite encouraging for the Woking-based squad as well. As all things stand, the three-team battle is not that far-fetched of a scenario in 2024, even though right now we're looking more towards a Ferrari-Red Bull standout for the remainder of the campaign. With Sainz's massive motivation to prove that he has what it takes to be a champion with the right car, and with Ferrari's massive steps made forward, which were further bolstered by Fred Vasseur's comments that the car is now much more easier to upgrade and the platform they have is giving them a lot of confidence that Red Bull are not far ahead, what do you think will happen in Suzuka? And more importantly, do you think that the Austrian team will show Mercedes how it's done by implementing their failed design on the RB20 and set a new standard on the grid? Let us know in the comments down below.